The howling wind carried the sound of desperate knocking across the empty Wyoming prairie as Ethan Nolan reached for his rifle, his weathered hand pausing mid-motion when he heard the unmistakable sound of a woman's voice calling for help. February 1885 had brought the harshest winter he'd seen in his 30 years, and visitors to his remote cabin were as rare as rainfall in the desert. "Pa, someone's at the door," 6-year-old Samuel whispered, his small frame appearing in the hallway, clutching his worn stuffed horse against his chest, eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear. "Stay back, Sam," Ethan instructed firmly, positioning himself between his son and whatever danger might be lurking outside. 3 years alone had taught him caution, the kind that kept you alive in these parts. The knocking came again, more urgent this time, accompanied by a sob. "Please." "Is anyone there? I need help." Ethan unlatched the door, pulling it open just enough to reveal a young woman collapsed against the doorframe, her face pale beneath a halo of auburn hair, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. Blood stained the sleeve of her coat, and her body trembled violently from cold or fear, perhaps both. "My wagon, overturned about a mile back," she managed between chattering teeth. "I've been walking, so cold." Before Ethan could respond, Samuel darted forward, peering around his father's legs at their unexpected visitor. The boy's eyes lit up with immediate fascination as he tugged at Ethan's pant leg. "I like her, Pa," Samuel whispered loudly, his voice carrying in the still cabin. "Please keep her." The woman's eyes, despite her obvious distress, softened at the child's words. Her lips curved into a fragile smile that transformed her face, revealing dimples in both cheeks. "Samuel," Ethan admonished gently, but he was already stepping aside, opening the door wider. "Madam, you'd better come in before you freeze to death." "Grace," she offered, her voice barely audible as she stumbled forward. "Grace Wilson." Ethan caught her as her knees buckled, lifting her easily into his arms. The scent of vanilla and something floral clung to her despite the sweat and blood. It had been so long since he'd held a woman that the sensation was almost foreign, disturbing in its familiarity. "Ethan Nolan," he responded gruffly, carrying her toward the fire. "And that's my son, Samuel." Samuel trailed behind them, his stuffed horse dragging on the floor. "Are you an angel, Miss Grace? Pa says Mama became an angel." Grace's eyes fluttered open at the boy's innocent question, meeting Ethan's gaze over the child's head. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of loss they both seemed to understand without words. "Not an angel, just lost," she murmured as Ethan set her down in the chair nearest the fire. "But grateful to have found your cabin." Ethan busied himself removing her wet coat, revealing a nasty gash on her upper arm. "This needs tending," he stated, his tone businesslike. "Sam, fetch the medicine box from the shelf." Samuel scampered away, eager to help, while Ethan assessed their visitor more thoroughly. Her clothes were of fine quality despite being soaked and mudded, not typical frontier wear. Her hands, though reddened from the cold, showed no calluses or signs of hard labor. Whatever had brought Grace Wilson to his door, she was a long way from where she belonged. "You're lucky," he said, keeping his voice low as he examined her wound. "Another hour out there and we'd be digging a grave come spring thaw." Grace winced as he probed the edges of the cut. "I'm beginning to think luck had nothing to do with it, Mr. Nolan. Providence, perhaps." Samuel returned with the wooden box containing Ethan's limited medical supplies. The boy hovered close, watching with undisguised fascination as his father cleaned and bandaged the stranger's arm. "Where'd you come from?" Ethan asked, focusing on his task rather than on how her skin felt beneath his fingers, soft, despite the chill that still clung to her. "Denver, originally," Grace replied, her breath catching as he applied iodine to the wound. "I was heading to Cheyenne to stay with my aunt when the accident happened. The driver, he didn't make it." Ethan's hands stilled. "You were traveling with just a driver, no escort?" A shadow crossed Grace's face. "I left in a hurry, Mr. Nolan. There wasn't time for proper arrangements." The evasion was clear, but Ethan didn't press. Everyone in the West carried secrets. His were buried under 3 feet of prairie soil alongside his wife. "You hungry, Miss Grace?" Samuel piped up, already pulling at the cupboard doors. Pa made stew and there's biscuits too. Grace smiled at the boy, her face transforming once again. Starving, actually, if it's not too much trouble. No trouble, Ethan found himself saying, though another mouth to feed was exactly that. Winter provisions were carefully calculated, but he couldn't bring himself to mention it with Samuel looking so animated, more excited than he'd been in months. As Grace ate, Samuel perched beside her, peppering her with questions about Denver, about her journey, about whether she knew how to fish or ride a horse. She answered each one patiently, her voice growing stronger as warmth and food restored her. Ethan watched them from across the room, an unexpected ache forming in his chest. The cabin hadn't heard a woman's laughter since Caroline died birthing Samuel. The sound was both painful and somehow necessary, like setting a broken bone. "You'll stay the night," he stated rather than asked when she'd finished eating. "Weather's turning worse. Come morning, if it's clear, I'll ride out to check your wagon, see what can be salvaged." Grace set down her spoon, meeting his eyes directly. "I don't want to impose, Mr. Nolan." "Ethan," he corrected, "and it's 40 miles to the nearest town. You're not imposing, you're surviving." Samuel clapped his hands together. "You can have my bed, Miss Grace. I'll sleep with Pa." Grace glanced between them, something vulnerable crossing her features before she nodded. "Thank you." "Both of you?" Later, after tucking Samuel into bed beside him, Ethan lay awake listening to the storm howling outside. The woman sleeping in his son's small bedroom was a complication he hadn't anticipated, one that stirred feelings he'd thought long buried. "Pa," Samuel whispered in the darkness. Is Miss Grace going to stay with us forever?" Ethan sighed, staring at the ceiling. "No, son, she has her own life to get back to." Samuel was quiet for so long Ethan thought he'd fallen asleep. "But she could," the boy finally murmured. "She could stay if she wanted." Ethan had no answer for that, and sleep was a long time coming. Morning brought clear skies but bone-chilling cold. Ethan rose before dawn, building up the fire and setting coffee to boil before preparing to check on Grace's wagon. He found her already awake, standing at the small window watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered plains in shades of pink and gold. She'd found Caroline's old hairbrush somewhere and had tamed her auburn hair into a simple braid that hung down her back. "It's beautiful here," she said without turning. "Lonely but beautiful. Gets into your blood," Ethan agreed, pouring coffee into a mug and offering it to her. The space, the silence. She accepted the coffee, her fingers brushing his. "Is that why you stay, so far from everything?" The question was innocent enough, but Ethan felt defensive nonetheless. "Got everything I need right here. Land's good for raising cattle. Sam's got room to grow." Grace sipped her coffee, studying him over the rim of the mug. "And that's enough." Before he could answer, Samuel burst into the room, hair sticking up in all directions, his eyes immediately finding Grace with undisguised delight. "You're still here," he exclaimed, as if he'd half expected her to vanish in the night. Grace smiled, kneeling to the boy's level. "I am." "And your father is going to check on my wagon today." Samuel's face fell. "So you can leave." The naked disappointment in his son's voice caught Ethan off guard. Samuel had always been content with their quiet life, never complaining about the lack of companions his own age or a mother's touch. Yet one night with this stranger had awakened something in the boy, a longing Ethan hadn't recognized was there. "Sam, Miss Wilson has places to be," Ethan said gently. "Now get dressed while I saddle up." Outside in the crisp morning air, Ethan moved through the familiar routine of preparing his horse, his mind troubled. Grace Wilson was clearly running from something or someone. Her hasty departure from Denver, traveling alone in winter, these weren't the actions of a woman simply visiting an aunt. An hour later, he discovered the overturned wagon half buried in a snowdrift. The driver lay nearby, his body already stiff with cold, eyes staring sightlessly at the cloudless sky. Ethan buried him as best he could with the frozen ground, marking the site with a crude cross fashioned from wagon pieces. The wagon itself had broken an axle, making it useless, but Ethan managed to salvage Grace's trunk and a few smaller bags. What surprised him most was the lack of provisions, no food stores for a long journey, minimal clothing. Just a small locked box that might contain valuables, and several books carefully wrapped in oilcloth. Whatever Grace Wilson was running toward, she had left in a desperate hurry from whatever she was running from. When he returned to the cabin, he found Grace and Samuel seated at the table, heads bent together over one of Samuel's reading primers. The boy was sounding out words with more enthusiasm than Ethan had ever managed to inspire, Grace's gentle encouragement bringing a flush of pride to Samuel's cheeks with each correct pronunciation. They looked up when he entered, and for a disorienting moment, they appeared to Ethan like a painting of domestic harmony, mother and child in a warm kitchen, waiting for the father's return. The image struck him with such force that he had to look away, busying himself with removing his coat and gloves. "I found your things," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Wagon's beyond repair, though," Grace nodded, her expression solemn, "and the driver." "Gave him what burial I could," Ethan answered, meeting her eyes. "Ground's too frozen for proper digging." Samuel looked between them, sensing the gravity of the conversation though not fully understanding it. "Did you find Miss Grace's books? She told me she has stories about knights and dragons." "I did," Ethan confirmed, forcing a smile for his son's benefit. "They're out in the barn. I'll bring them in later." Grace rose from the table, her hands smoothing down her skirt, Caroline's skirt, Ethan realized, recognizing the faded blue fabric. "Mr. Nolan, Ethan, I need to ask a tremendous favor." He knew what was coming before she said it. "The nearest town is Whiteridge," he said, cutting her off. "Supply wagon makes its run in 2 weeks. You're welcome to stay until then." Relief flooded her features, followed quickly by uncertainty. "I can work for my keep," she offered. "I'm a fair cook and I can help with Samuel's lessons." "You don't need to, please," she interrupted, her voice firm despite its softness. "I won't be a burden." Ethan recognized the pride in her stance, the same pride that had kept him from accepting help after Caroline died, when neighbors had offered to take Samuel while he grieved. "All right," he conceded, "but the cabin's small." "Smaller than where I've been living recently," she said with a cryptic smile. "It feels like a palace to me." Samuel, who had been following their exchange with intense interest, broke into a gap-toothed grin. "Does that mean Miss Grace is staying, Pa?" "For a little while," Ethan clarified, not wanting his son to grow too attached. "Just until the supply wagon comes." But the joy on Samuel's face told him it might already be too late for such cautions. The first week of Grace's stay established a routine that felt surprisingly natural. She took over much of the cooking, transforming Ethan's basic provisions into meals that reminded him of his mother's table. She spent hours with Samuel, not just on his reading but telling him stories and teaching him simple sums. To Ethan's surprise, she didn't shy away from the harder aspects of cabin life either. She helped with the chickens, learned to milk the cow, and even assisted with carrying firewood when Ethan would allow it. "You don't have to prove anything," he told her one evening as she insisted on helping him clean up after dinner. Her hands red from washing dishes in water that never seemed quite warm enough. Grace glanced at him, a strand of auburn hair falling across her face. "I'm not trying to prove anything. I just can't sit idle, never could, even back home." "What was home like?" Ethan asked, realizing how little he actually knew about her beyond her name and that she was running from something. Grace was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she did, her voice was distant, as if recalling a place from long ago rather than just months past. "My father was a banker in Denver. Our house had 14 rooms, most of which no one ever used," she said, her hands continuing their rhythmic washing. "I had piano lessons on Tuesdays, French on Thursdays, and every Sunday we attended services where everyone wore their finest clothes and pretended to care about their neighbors." The bitterness in her tone surprised him. "Sounds comfortable," he offered neutrally. "Comfortable?" she repeated, handing him a plate to dry. "Yes, I suppose it was. Like a beautiful cage is comfortable to a bird that's never known flight." Her eyes met his, challenging him to understand. "Have you ever done something you knew was right, even when everyone told you it was wrong?" Ethan thought of his decision to move west after Caroline died, against his family's wishes, their warnings that he couldn't raise a son alone in the wilderness. "Once or twice," he admitted. Grace seemed to study him, weighing his answer. "Then you understand why I left." Before he could ask what she meant, Samuel appeared in his nightshirt, clutching his stuffed horse and a book. "Miss Grace, will you read to me tonight, please?" The tension of the moment dissolved as Grace smiled at the boy. "Of course. Go climb into bed and I'll be right there." After she left the kitchen, Ethan finished the dishes alone, troubled by their conversation and by the growing ease with which Grace had slipped into their lives. Samuel was flourishing under her attention, and even Ethan had to admit the cabin felt more like a home with her presence. But she would leave when the supply wagon came, and they would return to their quiet existence. Only now they would know what they were missing. The second week brought a thaw that turned the snow to slush and made the yard a muddy mess. It also brought a fever to Samuel that had Ethan pacing the floor with worry. The boy had always been healthy, but childhood illnesses could turn deadly fast on the frontier, where doctors were distant memories and medicine was whatever you had on hand. Grace took charge with a calm efficiency that left no room for Ethan's fears. She made poultices for Samuel's chest, brewed willow bark tea for his fever, and sat with him through the night, bathing his hot forehead with cool cloths while singing soft lullabies Ethan had never heard before. "My mother used to sing to me when I was ill," she explained when she caught Ethan watching from the doorway, her voice husky with exhaustion after the second night of Samuel's fever. "I remember how safe it made me feel." Ethan leaned against the doorframe, fatigue pulling at him after too many sleepless nights. "I don't remember my mother singing," he admitted. "She died when I was younger than Sam." Grace's hand stilled on Samuel's forehead. "I'm sorry." "It was a long time ago," Ethan said, though the loss had shaped his entire life, had made him determined that Samuel would know his father's love even without a mother. "Loss doesn't diminish with time," Grace murmured, her eyes on the sleeping child. "It just becomes a part of who we are." The simple truth of her words struck Ethan deeply. "Caroline, Sam's mother, died bringing him into the world," he found himself saying. "I've never told him that, just that she became an angel." Grace nodded, understanding in her eyes. "He'll need to know someday, but not yet. Let him have angels a while longer." In that moment, watching her tend to his son with such gentle care, Ethan felt something shift inside him, a wall beginning to crumble, one he'd built carefully around his heart after Caroline's death. When Samuel's fever finally broke the next morning, Ethan found Grace asleep in the chair beside the boy's bed, her head at an awkward angle that would surely pain her when she woke. Without thinking, he gathered her in his arms just as he had that first night and carried her to his own bed. She stirred slightly as he laid her down but didn't wake, her body yielding to exhaustion. Ethan covered her with a blanket, allowing himself one moment to brush a strand of hair from her face before retreating. That afternoon, as Samuel napped and Grace still slept, Ethan stood outside the cabin staring at the distant mountains. The supply wagon would arrive in 3 days. Grace would leave, taking whatever magic she'd brought into their lives with her, unless he asked her to stay. The thought formed fully in his mind for the first time, startling in its clarity. But what did he have to offer a woman like Grace Wilson? A hardscrabble existence in a 2-room cabin, miles from civilization, winters that could kill the unprepared, summers of endless work. It was no life for someone raised with pianos and French lessons. Yet she had flourished here, had taken to frontier life with a determination that spoke of something more than mere necessity. And the way she looked at Samuel with genuine affection rather than pity for the motherless child stirred feelings in Ethan he'd thought long buried. He was still standing there when Grace found him, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes clear after her long rest. "Samuel's fever is completely gone," she said, coming to stand beside him. "He's asking for stew and biscuits, a sure sign of recovery." Ethan nodded, unable to look at her directly for fear she would read his thoughts. "Thank you for caring for him." "He's a remarkable child," Grace replied softly. "You've done well with him, Ethan." His name on her lips sent an unexpected warmth through him. "We manage." A comfortable silence stretched between them as they both gazed at the mountains, now visible with the thinning clouds. Finally, Grace spoke, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I was engaged to be married." Ethan turned to her, surprised by the confession. His name was Howard Blackwell, my father's business partner's son, she continued, her eyes still on the distant horizon. The perfect match, according to everyone who mattered in Denver society. What happened? Ethan asked when she fell silent. Grace's laugh held no humor. I discovered he was already married to a woman in Kansas City, had been for 3 years. She turned to face Ethan fully. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He simply said his first wife was unsuitable for his position in society, but that he couldn't divorce her without scandal. Ethan felt a surge of anger on her behalf. He expected you to accept that. Oh, it gets worse, Grace said, a bitter smile twisting her lips. He offered to keep me as his mistress, set me up in a house outside of town, said it was a generous arrangement considering my compromised virtue. Ethan's hands clenched involuntarily. Your virtue wasn't, no, Grace interrupted firmly, but he spread rumors that it was to ensure I would have no choice but to accept his offer. My father believed him over me. The final piece fell into place. That's why you left. Grace nodded, wrapping her arms around herself against a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I took my mother's jewelry, what money I had saved, and fled. My aunt in Cheyenne doesn't know I'm coming. I'm not even certain she'll take me in. But anywhere seemed better than staying in Denver as that man's possession. Ethan studied her face, seeing now the strength that had allowed her to survive not just the overturned wagon and brutal cold, but the betrayal and abandonment by those who should have protected her. What will you do in Cheyenne? He asked, though what he really wanted to know was whether she had considered not going at all. Grace shrugged, a surprisingly casual gesture that didn't match the tension in her shoulders. Find work, I suppose. I can read and write well enough to be a teacher, perhaps, or work in a shop. The image of Grace behind a counter, serving strangers day after day, struck Ethan as profoundly wrong. She belonged under open skies, her cheeks flushed with clean air, her hands busy with meaningful work. You could stay, he blurted out before he could reconsider. Here, I mean, with us. Grace's eyes widened, searching his face as if unsure she'd heard correctly. Ethan, I know it's not much, he hurried on, gesturing toward the cabin. And I know you're probably looking for something more than this, but Samuel adores you and the place runs better with you here. And Ethan, she interrupted gently, placing her hand on his arm. Are you asking me to stay as Samuel's caretaker? The question stopped him short, forcing him to examine his own motives. Was that all he wanted? Someone to care for his son, to make his life easier? No, he said finally, meeting her gaze directly. I'm asking you to stay because I think you belong here with Samuel, with me. The last words came out almost as a whisper, a confession he hadn't planned to make. Grace's hand tightened on his arm, her eyes never leaving his face. You barely know me, she said, though her voice held no rejection. I know enough, Ethan replied. I know you're brave and kind. I know Samuel has smiled more in these 2 weeks than in the year before. I know the cabin feels like a home again with you in it. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. I have nothing to offer you, Ethan. No dowry, no family connections, nothing but trouble following me from Denver. Ethan reached out, hesitantly at first, then with more confidence as he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I don't want any of those things, just you if you'll stay. Before she could answer, Samuel's voice called from inside the cabin, breaking the moment. Grace stepped back, her cheeks flushed. I should check on him, she said, but her eyes lingered on Ethan's face. We can talk more later. He nodded, watching her go, hoping he hadn't ruined whatever fragile thing was growing between them by speaking too soon. That evening, after Samuel was asleep, Grace joined Ethan on the small porch. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. It's never this clear in Denver, Grace said, her breath visible in the cold air. Too much smoke from the factories and chimneys. Ethan nodded, acutely aware of her presence beside him, of the scant inches separating their hands on the porch railing. One of the reasons I came west. Wanted Sam to grow up seeing the stars. Grace turned slightly toward him. Did you mean what you said earlier about wanting me to stay? Yes, Ethan answered without hesitation, but I understand if you can't, if Cheyenne is where you need to be. Grace was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful in the moonlight. "When I left Denver, I thought I was running away," she said finally. "But now I wonder if I was running toward something instead." She moved her hand until her fingers just touched his on the railing. "I've never felt as alive as I have these past 2 weeks, Ethan, never felt as necessary." The simple admission touched him deeply. "You are necessary," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "To Samuel, to me." Grace's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "Then I'll stay." Ethan turned his hand over, catching her fingers in his. "It won't be easy. Winter's harsh, summers are all work, and there's no guarantees the cattle will thrive or the crops will grow." "I don't need easy," Grace replied, her fingers tightening around his. "I just need real." The distance between them vanished as Ethan drew her closer, one hand cupping her cheek with a tenderness he'd forgotten he possessed. When their lips met, it felt like coming home after a long journey, familiar yet new, comfortable yet thrilling. Grace responded with a shy eagerness that spoke of limited experience but genuine feeling. When they finally parted, her eyes were bright with something Ethan recognized as hope, the same hope blooming in his own chest. "We should do this properly," he said, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. "Court for a while, let Sam get used to the idea," Grace laughed softly. "I think Samuel had this planned from the moment I arrived. I like her, Pa. Please keep her," she quoted with fond amusement. Ethan smiled, remembering his son's immediate acceptance of Grace. "He's always been a good judge of character." The supply wagon arrived 3 days later, bringing with it not just provisions but news from Whiteridge and beyond. Ethan made arrangements for the wagon driver, Jim Collins, to deliver a letter to Grace's aunt in Cheyenne, explaining her situation and her decision to remain in Wyoming territory. "Folks in town will be mighty interested to hear about Miss Wilson staying on," Jim commented as he loaded the empty crates back onto his wagon. "Single woman moving in with a widower and his boy, tongues will wag." Ethan straightened, fixing the older man with a steady gaze. "Miss Wilson will be my wife before spring," he said firmly. "You can tell that to any wagging tongues." Jim grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Figured as much. Good for you, Nolan. Boy needs a mother and you've been alone too long." As the wagon pulled away, Ethan turned to find Grace standing in the doorway of the cabin, Samuel at her side. The boy had insisted on wearing his best shirt, the one usually reserved for Christmas, to mark the occasion of Grace officially staying. "Did you mean that?" Grace asked quietly when he reached them. "About being your wife before spring," Samuel looked between them with undisguised interest. "I did," Ethan confirmed, meeting her gaze steadily. "If you'll have me." Samuel tugged at Grace's skirt. "Say yes, Miss Grace, then you'll be my ma for real." Grace knelt to the boy's level, her eyes serious. "Samuel, I could never replace your real mother. She'll always be the angel watching over you." Samuel considered this solemnly before nodding. "But I can have an angel ma in heaven and a real ma here, right?" Grace glanced up at Ethan, who nodded encouragingly. "Yes," she answered, her voice thick with emotion, "if that's what you want." "It is," Samuel declared with all the certainty of childhood. "And Pa wants it too. He smiles all the time now and he didn't used to." Ethan felt heat rise to his face at his son's frank assessment, but he couldn't deny the truth of it. Grace had brought light back into their lives in ways he hadn't even recognized were missing. "Well then," Grace said, rising to face Ethan, "I suppose I should say yes." Ethan took her hands in his, aware of Samuel watching them with rapt attention. "Grace Wilson, will you marry me? Be Samuel's mother and my wife?" Grace's smile was radiant as she nodded. "Yes, Ethan Nolan, I will." Samuel whooped with delight, dancing around them in circles. "I knew it." "I told you we should keep her, Pa," Ethan laughed, lifting Samuel into his arms while keeping one hand linked with Grace's. "You sure did, son. Smartest thing I ever did was listen to you." They were married 2 weeks later by the circuit preacher who visited Whiteridge monthly. The ceremony took place in their cabin, with Samuel as the only witness besides Jim Collins and his wife, who had insisted on coming along to make things proper. Grace wore a simple dress of pale blue that Mrs. Collins had helped her alter from one of her Denver gowns. Ethan had shaved carefully and donned his one good shirt, while Samuel proudly carried the simple gold band Ethan had purchased in town. The preacher, a weathered man named Reverend Hawkins who had seen countless frontier marriages, kept the ceremony brief but meaningful. When Ethan slipped the ring onto Grace's finger, he felt a sense of rightness that transcended any lingering doubts. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Hawkins pronounced, "I now declare you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Samuel was the first to clap, his enthusiasm making up for the small audience. Mrs. Collins dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and even Jim looked suspiciously misty as Ethan kissed his bride. That night, after Samuel had fallen asleep exhausted from the excitement, Ethan and Grace stood in the main room of the cabin that was now truly their home. The fire cast a warm glow over the simple furnishings, transforming the ordinary into something magical. "Are you happy?" Ethan asked, suddenly uncertain. The day had moved so quickly, and they had known each other such a short time. "This isn't the life you were raised for." Grace moved into his arms with a confidence that belied their newness. "This is exactly the life I was meant for," she said, her head fitting perfectly against his shoulder. "I just took a roundabout way of finding it." Their coming together that night was tender and unhurried, a gentle exploration of new territory for both of them. Ethan discovered that Grace's skin was as soft as it had looked that first night, and that the sound of her breath catching when he kissed the hollow of her throat was the sweetest music he'd ever heard. Grace learned that Ethan's hands, rough from years of working the land, could be incredibly gentle, and that the strength in his arms made her feel protected rather than confined. In the quiet aftermath, as they lay tangled in each other's arms, Ethan traced idle patterns on Grace's bare shoulder. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he admitted. "After Caroline died, I figured that part of my life was over." Grace propped herself up to look at him, her hair falling around them like a curtain. "I understand," she said softly, "but I'm glad you were wrong." Ethan smiled, pulling her down for another kiss. "So am I." Spring came early that year, bringing with it new calves in the small herd and the first tender shoots in the garden Grace had insisted on expanding. Samuel thrived under her care, his reading improving rapidly, and his natural curiosity encouraged rather than merely tolerated. The cabin itself transformed with Grace's influence. Curtains appeared at the windows, made from fabric ordered from the Sears catalog. A shelf of books grew along one wall, and wildflowers in jars brightened the table during summer months. It wasn't all easy. Grace had nightmares sometimes, waking in a cold sweat from dreams where Howard Blackwell found her and dragged her back to Denver in disgrace. On those nights, Ethan would hold her close, promising that no one would ever hurt her again, a promise he intended to keep at any cost. For his part, Ethan still had moments when guilt would overtake him, usually when he caught himself watching Grace hang laundry or teach Samuel, moments of domestic peace that Caroline would never experience with their son. Grace seemed to sense these moods and would give him space, understanding without words that some grief never fully heals. They balanced each other in ways neither had expected. Ethan's practical nature complemented Grace's more creative spirit. His quiet strength provided a foundation for her to rebuild her confidence, while her warmth gradually thawed the parts of him that had frozen after Caroline's death. When autumn came, bringing with it golden light and crisp mornings, Grace shared news that changed everything once again. "Ethan," she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Samuel already asleep inside, "I've been to see Mrs. Collins in town." Ethan turned to her, concern immediate in his expression. "Are you unwell?" Grace smiled, taking his hand and placing it gently on her stomach. "Quite the opposite. We're going to have a baby." The world seemed to stop for a moment as Ethan processed her words, his hand splayed across her still flat abdomen. A tangle of emotions swept through him: joy, fear, wonder, and a sharp memory of losing Caroline in childbirth. Grace read the conflict in his eyes. "I know you're afraid," she said softly. "I am too, a little, but Mrs. Collins says I'm healthy and strong. This isn't like before, Ethan." Ethan pulled her into his arms, his face buried in her hair. "I can't lose you," he whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside him. "I couldn't bear it." Grace held him just as tightly. "You won't lose me, I promise you that." they told Samuel the next morning over breakfast. The boy stared at them in silence for so long that Grace began to worry they had upset him somehow. "Sam," Ethan prompted gently, "what do you think about having a little brother or sister?" Samuel's face suddenly broke into a wide grin. "I knew it," he exclaimed, bouncing in his seat. "I asked for a brother for Christmas, and now I'm getting one," Grace laughed, relieved. "It might be a sister, Samuel. We won't know until the baby arrives." The boy considered this new information seriously before shrugging. "That's all right, too, as long as she likes horses and fishing." Through the winter months, Grace's body changed, her slender frame growing rounded with new life. Ethan found himself both fascinated and terrified by the transformation, hovering close whenever she performed even the simplest tasks. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," Grace finally said in exasperation one February afternoon when he tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of mending to the rocking chair. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "Not my babies," Ethan replied stubbornly, "not my wife." Grace softened, setting down the basket to cup his face in her hands. "I love that you worry, but you're going to drive us both mad before spring if you don't ease up a little." Ethan pressed his forehead to hers, his hands finding the swell of her stomach where their child grew. "I'll try," he promised, "but no more chopping wood or lifting anything heavier than Samuel's storybooks." Grace rolled her eyes but agreed to the compromise, secretly touched by his concern. The baby decided to arrive early, on a clear April morning when the wildflowers were just beginning to dot the prairie. Grace's labor progressed quickly, too quickly for Ethan to fetch Mrs. Collins from town as they had planned. "The baby's coming now," Grace gasped, her face pale with pain but her eyes clear and determined. "You'll have to help me, Ethan." Ethan had sent Samuel to the neighbor's farm 5 miles away at the first signs of labor, a plan they had arranged weeks in advance. Now, alone with Grace as she brought their child into the world, he had never felt more terrified or more in awe of her strength. "Tell me what to do," he said, fighting to keep his voice steady as he helped her to their bed. Grace guided him through each step, her voice strained but remarkably calm between contractions. Ethan followed her instructions with shaking hands, praying harder than he had since the night Caroline died. When their daughter slipped into his waiting hands just as the sun reached its zenith, Ethan felt tears streaming down his face. The tiny girl announced her arrival with a lusty cry that seemed impossibly loud for such a small being. "Grace," he whispered, placing the squirming, red-faced infant on his wife's chest. "She's perfect. You're perfect." Grace was weeping too, her hands gently exploring their daughter's face, counting fingers and toes. "She looks like you," she said, looking up at Ethan with exhausted radiance. "She has your eyes." Ethan sat beside them on the bed, one arm around Grace's shoulders, the other hand gently touching his daughter's downy head. "What shall we name her?" Grace considered the tiny face, now calming as the newborn found her mother's warmth. "Caroline," she said softly, watching Ethan's expression, "to honor the woman who gave you Samuel, if that's all right." Ethan felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Caroline Grace Nolan," he amended, "to honor both the women who have blessed my life beyond measure." When Samuel returned later that day, escorted by their neighbor, he approached the bed where Grace rested with the baby with unusual caution. His eyes were wide as he peered at his sister's tiny face. "She's awfully small," he observed dubiously. "Too small for fishing, I think." Grace laughed, the sound tired but genuine. "She'll grow, Samuel, and you'll be the one to teach her fishing when she's ready." The boy brightened at this prospect. "Can I hold her?" Ethan showed his son how to sit in the chair with his arms positioned just so, then carefully transferred the swaddled infant into his embrace. The look of wonder on Samuel's face as he gazed down at his sister was something Ethan knew he would remember until his dying day. "Hello, Caroline," Samuel whispered. "I'm your big brother. I've been waiting for you." As summer bloomed across the prairie, the Nolan family settled into a new rhythm. Caroline thrived, growing plumper by the day on her mother's milk. Samuel took his role as big brother seriously, proudly showing the baby his favorite spots around the property when she was old enough to be carried outside. Ethan watched his family with a sense of gratitude that sometimes overwhelmed him. The cabin that had once felt too empty now seemed perfectly sized for the four of them, filled with laughter, occasional tears, and the countless small moments that wove together to create a life. One evening, as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, Ethan found Grace on the porch with Caroline sleeping against her shoulder. The scene was so peaceful, so right, that he paused in the doorway, unwilling to disturb it. "I can hear you thinking," Grace said without turning around. "Come sit with us." Ethan moved to join them on the bench, his arm automatically encircling both his wife and daughter. "Just thinking how different everything is from a year ago," he admitted. "How empty this place was before you knocked on that door." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, her free hand finding his. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd never come this way, if the wagon hadn't overturned?" "Sometimes," Ethan confessed. "But then I think maybe it wasn't chance at all. Maybe we were always meant to find each other." Grace smiled, lifting her face for his kiss. "I believe that," she whispered against his lips. "With all my heart." Inside the cabin, Samuel's voice called out for his evening story. Caroline stirred against Grace's shoulder, making the soft, snuffling sounds that usually preceded her waking. The peaceful moment was ending, giving way to the beautiful chaos of family life. Ethan stood, offering his hand to help Grace up. "Shall we?" As they moved toward the warm light spilling from the cabin windows, toward the son waiting impatiently for his story and the daughter beginning to demand her own attention, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that this family, this love, this life was everything he had never known to wish for. And it had all begun with a desperate knock on a cabin door and a little boy's whispered plea. "I like her, Pa, please keep her." Sometimes, Ethan reflected as he closed the door behind them, the greatest wisdom came from the simplest source. And sometimes, the bravest decision was simply to open the door and let love in.